window now. Okay.
So good morning, everyone. This is the Natural England Climate Change webinar series, the second webinar in the series. I'm Mike Morecroft, and you're very welcome, whether you're from Natural England or from some of our partner organisations. And we've got a good mixture of people on the call. I can already see that, so that's great. Just a couple of housekeeping announcements. If you haven't heard them already, you are joining in muted mode. This is to stop background noise. We can unmute you when we come to the discussion at the end, but during the webinar itself, if you could use the chat facility on the webinar, that would be much appreciated. There will be questions at the end. You can type your question as we go along, and we'll come back to them and answer them best we can. We're also keen to open up a discussion. Can I also just request again, if people could not use the video camera, if you could turn the video off, the box or a little circle at the bottom of the screen, just to try and save bandwidth. When WebEx, the system we use, sometimes struggles with people joining by by video as well as by phone. Okay, let's go on to the next slide, Simon. Next slide, please. So, as I've already said, I'm Mike, and my colleagues Sarah Taylor and Simon Duffield are doing this with me this morning. Very much team effort. Next slide. And this is the second in the series. The focus this morning is adaptation, how we can reduce the adverse impacts of climate change on nature conservation. The focus is on nature conservation. The next 2 weeks, we're going to be looking with a rather wider canvas for nature-based solutions and how managing the natural environment better, we can help people to adapt to climate change and to reduce climate change itself. But for today, we're sticking with the focus on nature conservation and particularly biodiversity. Next slide. There is a little bit of a lag on some of the slide changes. Obviously, lots of people home working.
Is it not moving
Next slide. It's not.
You're on the adaptation manual.
Oh, there we go. There we go. That's fine. Just to note, we've recently published the Climate Change Adaptation Manual with the RSPB, a joint effort, and this is a major achievement, we feel, for us, and hopefully something that's useful to you. So we're partly taking advantage of that opportunity to run these webinars. But it's the go-to piece of advice if you want to know more after this webinar. We'll come back to that, though. Next slide, please. So just a quick outline of where we're going to. Just before we do that, I will say this webinar is being recorded, and we will be making the recordings of all of the webinars in this series available afterwards. If you miss it, you want to come back to it, or you have colleagues who would like to have a look. We're just looking to see how we can best make that available. We can make it available easily within the organisation, but just looking to make it available to partners as well. We're looking at how to get it onto YouTube, which I hope we'll be able to do in the next week or so. We're also, I should say, hoping to run this whole series of webinars again through the month of June, because they have been oversubscribed in May. So there is another opportunity to hear what we've got to say and contribute if you've got colleagues who haven't managed to make it this time round. So I'm clearly giving the introduction. We're then going to look at the principles for how to adapt to climate change from Simon, and then move on to how this might actually look in practice, drawing on some of our experience in Natural England and sharing some of the tools and resources that are available, which Sarah will be doing. Next slide, please. So if you joined us last week, you'll have heard me going through in some detail about the evidence for climate change itself and also its impacts on the natural world. And there's this headline message that I said then, and I'll say again because I think it's worth repeating, that there is strong evidence that climate change is affecting UK biodiversity. And if you're a nature conservationist or someone who cares about the natural environment and our species and habitats, that translates into a series of risks and opportunities. The obvious one is that cold-adapted species are at threat under a warmer climate, sometimes because of their own physiological limits, more often because of being outcompeted by other species which are better adapted. But there are a whole series of other risks as well. So it's not just the montane habitats with the cold-adapted species, it's also wetland habitats. They're at threat from changes in precipitation, summer rainfall declining particularly. And at the coast, the effects of a rising sea level are a major threat to coastal habitats. And we'll be looking today at how we can address some of that threat. And then there's the effects of extreme events, droughts, wildfire, flood, all of which there is an increasing risk of in a changing climate. And ever present in a country like the UK, the interactions of a pressure like climate change with habitat fragmentation and degradation. So that's on the risk side, and those are just examples really of very generic categories. But there are also some opportunities. And for example, with warm adapted species, particularly those that can move easily, can spread and colonize new areas. So there are some opportunities. And addressing these risks and the opportunities is really the stuff of adaptation, which we're going to be talking about for the rest of the time. Next slide. When we think about responding to climate change, within the climate change world, we tend to use two words, mitigation and adaptation. And mitigation particularly can cause some confusions. It's a little different to the way we might use it, for example, in planning and the effects of a building development on a habitat. In terms of climate change mitigation, it refers to tackling the causes of climate change itself, so reducing greenhouse gas emissions and sequestering carbon. And the natural environment's important in that, and the whole of our focus for next week's webinar will be on how we can better manage the natural environment to reduce emissions and sequester carbon. What we're dealing with today, though, is adaptation, which is all about dealing with the effects of climate change, how we reduce vulnerability of our biodiversity and other aspects of the environment, and also increasingly how we adjust to change. Next slide. So just to give you a formal definition of climate change adaptation, and I always advise people not to get too bogged down on definitions. You can always find some problems around the edge of them, but this is one that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change used in its last assessment report, which is the process of adjustment to actual or expected climate change and its effects. And it applies to human as well as natural systems. So in human systems, adaptation seeks to moderate or avoid harm or exploit beneficial opportunities. But it then goes on to say that in some natural systems, human intervention may facilitate adjustment to expected climate and its effects. So we're in that space of how do we adjust? How do we do things differently to cope better with the effects of climate change, which are happening now and will increasingly become a factor that we have to contend with if we're engaged in biological conservation. Now, that's my introduction done. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to Simon, the man with the controls, and to take us from here. Over to you, Simon.
Okay, thanks for that, Mike. So yeah, a new voice on the phone. I'm Simon Duffield. I'm one of the climate change specialists in Natural England as well. And Mike really has asked me to really summarise the principles behind adaptation, with the focus on adaptation, as you said, for the natural environment, not around ecosystem-based adaptation, nature-based solutions. So adaptation to climate change for the natural environment. So a starting point, it's when I almost started climate change work, over a decade ago, is a really good paper from 2009 by Heller and Zavaleta, and they looked at all the recommendations that were out there at that time around adaptation for the natural world, and they identified well over 100. As you can see, I like text on my slides. Well over 100 different actions, and they're quite disparate, from quite specific actions to quite broad actions. That was over a decade ago. If you did the same literature search today, you would find 300, 400, 500 different actions. So there is a vast range out there, but fortunately for us, you can simplify them down into several core themes. And I was really just going to use a few examples to talk through what these themes could look like or do look like. So the first one is around building resilience. It's a term which has been bandied around, off the tip of the tongue of many people for the last couple of years. And it's really about interventions that aim to build the robustness of systems, not necessarily against climate change, but also more broadly against other adverse pressures. So they either can resist change and or recover from change. But if you listened to Mike last week, you know that the impacts of climate change are increasing, and the clue is in the name that change is coming. So the next suite of actions and interventions are all about how we consider that change, whether we accommodate it, whether we resist it, whether we direct it. So there's a whole suite of adaptation interventions that consider change management. And that's the actual outputs, that's the actions that we want to try and put in place. But equally important is how we actually do it. It's the how we try to deliver resilience and how we manage change. So there's a whole suite of interventions that are based on our approach and ways of working. So just thinking about the change for a little bit longer, because it has changed since the original paper was published. 2010, 2009, there was really this view that, change is coming, but it's relatively small, and we need to just accommodate it. Of course, the increasing observation of impacts, the direction of travel, moving into 3-4 degree world, means this change is going to become far more transformative. So we might still think about accommodating it. We might actually need to be far more proactive in terms of promoting change, directing change. So there's a whole range of interventions and actions that promote adaptation that cover all those different facets of change management. So we've made it very simple. Now we're going to try and make it a little bit more complicated again, because, of course, as I said, there's a disparate number of actions that could promote resilience. Luckily, again, we can identify some core areas, core themes. Many of them, especially around resilience, align very closely with existing best conservation practice, which is both reassuring in that adaptation doesn't mean we've got to forget everything, but also, as we'll see later on, will take us just so far, and then we need to think about more and more climate change specific actions. So, core in the current and future response to climate change is the role of protected areas. It's a conservation principle we've done for many decades. We identify what's important and we try and protect it, whether it's an MPA, whether it's a local nature reserve, or even just a place in a farmer's field. We need to identify and protect those areas that are important. The evidence suggests that the protected area network is beneficial both for those species which are suffering from climate change. They encourage the persistence, but also supporting those species that are actually benefiting from climate change in terms of facilitating their movement. So protected areas will remain core. There could be questions around the location and how you actually measure success on them, but they will remain fundamentally important and key to adaptation. Through the regulatory side on protected areas, we try and encourage best management practice. Favourable condition is what we're looking for, because a site which is in favourable condition is likely to be more resilient both to climate change and other drivers. So we spend a lot of money on action and intervention, whether it's a local reserve, whether it's a national reserve, whether it's in your garden, trying to work out what best management practice is. So whether it's the right grazing, the right cutting, we spend a lot of time doing this. Not just on the regulatory side, but of course it's a lot of what our agri-environment schemes try and do, promoting optimal management to promote resilience. And in many ways, what they're trying to do is consider what has degraded the natural environment already and trying to address those. So they're not necessarily climate change specific pressures, but it's trying to respond to what has compromised our natural world. So they can be on-site measures, such as restoring the hydrological function and natural processes of a site. Or they could be broader off-site issues, the Lawton approach to habitat creation to bigger, better and more join up resilience of ecological networks. The thing about all these three areas is that this essentially is best existing conservation practice. It will remain core to the future, but it will only take us so far. And there are risks around it if this is the only thing we think about. And we need to understand those risks. Just because something has worked in the past, it doesn't mean it's necessarily going to work in the future. And we're beginning to see increasing evidence of this. You might have heard of some of the work around the high brown fertility, where conservation interventions that worked 20 years ago are beginning to seem to be a little bit less effective. The suggestion being there's a climate change signal in there as well. The second thing is if you don't consider climate change and we deliver existing best practice, we might actually increase the vulnerability of the system we're interested in. So, and again, just one example to highlight it. As a young, fresh-faced advisor years ago, I used to advise on woodland management, and it was all about trying to get warmth and heat into some of the woodlands. Open rise, box junctions, scalloped edges. Of course, from the climate change perspective, and depending on your priority, if your interest was in ancient woodland flora that need cool, damp locations, opening up your wood would be the last thing you should be doing, especially if you're working on something like a beech woodland in southern England, for example. So we need to understand what the climate change threat is on particular elements that we're interested in and identify the appropriate climate change specific responses to it. Those responses are very context specific, and again I'll just highlight why and where and how we need to think about these things. So we've already mentioned sea level rise, a threat across most of our coasts, but the responses will need to be different depending on where you may be. So in this case, this is a reserve in Cumbria, sea level rise threatening the dune system, but the modelling suggests that as long as we ensure that there's adequate sediment coming onto that site, the dune system will be able to respond appropriately. Can be quite resilient with sufficient sediment. In other parts of the country, if you're on a coastal site, this might not be the issue. It might be the fact you've got insufficient space. So you need to think about ensuring you've got natural rollback, so space for natural rollback, or again being far more proactive and thinking about managed realignment. You need to understand the threat through the context of your own site to identify appropriate answers. Again, still trying to build resilience. And sometimes those answers might seem counterintuitive. We talk a lot about encouraging natural processes to deliver and build resilience, but sometimes in the short to medium term that might not be the right response. And I'll highlight through an example. This is Calthorpe Broad, an NNR in East Anglia. It's a very small reserve and actually perched above the surrounding landscape, threatened by drying and warming in the east. But if we introduced natural processes at this stage, the actual site will probably drain. It would actually lose its water and the interest the freshwater interest would be lost. So the response in this situation was actually to try and get greater control of the natural system and actually have greater anthropogenic management of it. And the implementation and introduction of water pumps has actually saved this broad over the last 2 summers. So sometimes your responses might be a little bit counterintuitive. We've looked at systems and habitats, but the same type of consideration is needed for adaptation of species. So alpine plants, we know, are threatened by climate change, warming, loss of space. However, at the same time, they also grow more or less everywhere. And I apologise for the botanists because I know these are not the same species, but it's just to illustrate a point. You can grow alpine plants, for example, in the garden of the post office in my local village. The climate change threat is mediated indirectly in large cases for alpine plants. So if you understand the threat, you can put in appropriate interventions. In this case, the loss is likely to be driven by increased competition by plants that used to not be able to survive in that formerly inhospitable environment. So your intervention would be thinking about maybe grazing or other management interventions to address the competition. So we've moved away from some of the generic, thinking a little bit more of the climate change specific. And another area of climate change consideration, which is going to become increasing to the fore, is that of climate change refugia. Now, I know Mike talked about these last week, so I'll just skip through this quite quickly. Climate change refugia, often thought of as the peaks of mountains sticking up from the ice sheet in the last ice age. But of course, the world has changed dramatically since then. So we are now looking at places of the country that will remain cooler in a warming world. And there's evidence both at a national scale that these are already found in the UK. There's parts of the country which are showing less warming than other places, and in those parts of the country, the rates of persistence of threatened species is increased. So climate change refugia are existing in this country at the 10-kilometre scale. They also exist at a far finer scale. This is the Lizard Peninsula in Cornwall, and again, the situation is very similar. The rates of climate change are moderated by the landscape, in this case, proximity to the coast, north-facing slopes, and in those places where the climate is changing less rapidly, you see greater persistence of threatened species, less community change. So climate change refugia, if you think about conservation, you know sites. Do you know where they are? These are going to become increasingly important areas that we need to protect. And whilst on the subject of refugia, if you go down an even finer scale, we're going to have to start thinking about using these features of the landscape that we've got control over. So elements of habitats, your trees, your scrub, and your sward. And we can use that to try and produce micro-refugial conditions. If you think, we're projected a 3 to 4 degree change in average summer temperatures, for example, in southern England. But the temperature difference on the ground between the sward of a long and a short grassland can be 15 to 20 degrees. So by manipulating some of these landscape assets, we can actually start promoting micro-refugial conditions and therefore promoting the resilience of the species that need them. So that was resilience. As we all accept, the climate means that change is coming. Resilience will only take us so far, whatever we do. And then there is this range of accommodating through to transformation, being reactive to be proactive. But change management is really important. Just looking at a couple of case studies, we can do that. We do need to think about the appropriate setting of targets and aspirations for protected sites, for example. Oh, I've just moved my cursor off the move forward button. So just can illustrate this through the example of Porlock in North Devon. Over the last 100 years, the land behind Porlock has gone from quite intensive lowland grazing fields through to a freshwater system, through to a semi-tidal coastal system when the shingle bank was breached, due in some respect to climate change sea level rise. However, that site has remained important for conservation the entire time. If we assessed it now based on what was there 100 years ago, we would say, this is terrible, it's in very unfavourable condition. However, by adjusting the management to reflect these new conditions, a new reality, it remains in favourable or unfavourable recovering status. It remains important and will do going forward. That is a very passive way reacting to what change we're seeing. We're going to increasingly need to look at more proactive, transformative approaches, and I'll just highlight what this could look like, and that is around translocation. Translocation for climate change purposes is going to become an increasing consideration, and it's difficult. This is an example for a lichen in the Cairngorms, which was translocated out of its climate envelope area. It requires a great deal of research, background monitoring to understand where, why, and how this can be done. This thing was almost impossible to find. They couldn't find it. We couldn't find it. It's tiny. Just to illustrate in a little facetious manner that this is hard, this takes effort, so we need to put more and more resource into trying to think about where and why transformation is appropriate. But we are going to have to be there. Some species are not going to track climate change in a way that they need, and we are going to start being far more proactive in our responses. But as I said, that's the outputs, that's the outcomes we're looking for, but the way the weather is now, how we deliver that is really, really a challenge. We go from the wettest to the driest to the hottest to the coldest in the space of a week. Have we got our management systems in place that deliver that optimum management, that deliver that protection? We need to increase the flexibility, whether it's the types of machinery, whether it's the amount of land for layback for your animals, the type of grazing animal needs to be able to respond to the increased variance of the weather we're seeing. And it's going beyond variance. We're getting greater extreme events. The amount of wildfire, flooding, drought, etc. means that we have to go beyond flexibility. We need to think about full-scale contingency planning. And we need to think of the future. Tree planting, the obvious example. A tree you plant now needs to survive in a climate that's going to be there in 50 years. With all of this, there's a great deal of uncertainty still. So the adaptive management, the learning through doing approach is absolutely core. And I think, Sarah, that was a bit of a rush through, but I will now hand over to you to take it from there.
Wonderful, Simon. Thank you very much. Oh, are you sure you're finished? Yeah, okay. The slides, I think there's a bit of a delay. So, yeah, apologies if there's a delay in the slides moving forward. Thanks, Simon. And hello, everybody. My name's Sarah Taylor. I work with Mike and Simon. I'm another of the senior specialists in climate change, and I work particularly on adaptation in Natural England. So as Simon's described, we've obviously, with our colleagues and with our friends in a wide range of organisations, we've been working for many years on how we think about change adaptation in principle. We've also been doing a lot of work on how we the range of approaches to help us think about adaptation in practice. And it's really important, those putting those principles into practice requires us to think, plan and take action at a range of different scales. And we hope that, I'll be able to show you that we've got some resources and we've been working on some things that will help us do that. And that range of scales, it might be obvious, but we need to work at that kind of national level. We've got things like the Nature Recovery Network coming up and the way we assess favourable conservation status that works at national and even international scales that need to incorporate climate change as a core part of how we work. Then we move down to a landscape scale. We're sort of thinking more in that area now. that's related to the Nature Recovery Network in the fact that we'll have nature recovery areas, but also within Natural England and across the range of partners, we have those landscape scale project areas or approaches. For us, we call them focus areas. But then, as Simon's mentioned, our sites, incredibly important still, our national nature reserves, our SSSIs, etc. Adaptation needs to happen at that scale. So the resources that we provide need to be able to draw in those principles on resilience building, accommodating change, and moving towards that transformation. And these things, we haven't made them up from scratch. We're using and building on well-known principles, such as the Lawton principles when it comes to designing ecological networks, such as bigger, better, more, and joined. But we know that climate change needs to be in the centre of that. And that means that we can put those interest features that we have, those sites, that landscape scale setting, and that national setting, we have some coherence between those scales and some continuity across them. Next slide, please. So as Mike mentioned at the beginning, we've recently published with the RSPB the second edition of our Climate Change Adaptation Manual. And it's a big deal for us. We've drawn together a lot of the thinking, a lot of the evidence and information and science and experience that we have in climate change adaptation into this document. It's been well used in the past, so we're hoping that it will be well used as we go forward. The aim of it is to support decision-making, practical and pragmatic decision-making on adaptation, bringing together tools and resources so that people can actually use that to plan and think about adaptation at a range of scales. So if you have seen the manual before, you know previously it had a strong focus on habitats. Now we've developed it much further, and we've complemented those habitat sections with a new species section. Both of those things draw evidence together, looking at the sensitivity of habitats and species, potential vulnerability, and then suggesting potential adaptation responses. We also have now included some substantial thematic sections that look at green infrastructure, geology and geomorphology, access and recreation, and they look again at how things are sensitive to change, and how we might assess impacts, vulnerability, and then through to adaptation action. For us, that means that there's information now on a much wider range of conservation activities that we carry out, but also that our partners work on, that will really need that adaptation as well. It's a big document. It's a really long document. It's a huge sort of encyclopedic set of information, so it's not something to be read from front to back. But we think that you can dip in and out and take the bits and pieces that you need. And we really think that it is going to be important and useful to a range of people across, including managers of nature reserves, protected sites, conservation organisations, land management advisors, consultants, and, broader than that even into local, national governments, statutory agencies, non-government organisations, local authorities. We hope that it's a wide range of conservation practitioners that will be able to use this. It also now incorporates two landscape-scale climate change assessment methods, one of which is from Natural England, which I'll go into a bit later, and the other example is from the RSPB. So you've got a lot of information in there, supported by key concepts and background information. Next slide, please. While I'm waiting for it to go on, I'll start talking. I wanted to introduce another of our recent publications that we're really pleased about, the Nature Networks Evidence Handbook. Clearly, ecological networks are a really important element of building resilience and accommodating change for species and habitats and ecosystems. This was led by Humphrey Crick, but has significant climate change team input. And, much like the Climate Change Adaptation Manual, it draws together principles and the underpinning evidence that we need to help us think about how we design our nature networks. So again, very much with that drawing together of evidence, but providing something practical that people can do to help think about designing networks that incorporate a range of different requirements and needs. So clearly we want our nature to recover and our ecosystems to recover, but this handbook incorporates people as specific beneficiaries and users of the nature networks, making sure that we can keep that connection or build that connection between nature and people. So we work through this. It uses considerations of constraints and opportunities. We're looking at landscape, geology, ecosystems, the requirements for ecological networks to help us think about how we would design those nature networks with a wide range of partners and stakeholders, and of course trying to encourage the restoration of natural processes whilst bearing in mind Simon's point about some real key management practices that would need to continue. And I just wanted to highlight within the document there's a range of ecological rules of thumb that have been put together. So again, building some principles, some practical things that we can help to use, help to design ecological networks, and these really sit alongside and should feel quite familiar with the Lawson principles, thinking about how our core wildlife sites sit within the wider network, so increasing those core sites, increasing the number of core sites, decreasing fragmentation, and increasing the ability or connectivity across the landscape, and making sure that we have a focus on very large areas where nature can recover and those natural processes can be given the chance to start to work again. And just to make a quick point on this, there's a full report with all the information in it, but there's also a summary for practitioners that's available on our website. Next slide, please. So there are a range of other resources that are really important to mention, and this goes much wider than this. I'm able to identify a few key resources that we use on a regular basis, and some of which that we've developed, but of course there are many, many resources out there that our partners and colleagues have produced. But I just wanted to highlight a few that we point to in some of our planning documents that we'll come to in a moment. Very importantly, the climate change impacts report cards. Mike's mentioned these previously in the last presentation, but also in this presentation. The biodiversity climate change impacts report card that Natural England led on draws together information evidence on the impacts that we're seeing under climate change and that we project that we will see. But there are other documents, report cards looking at water, infrastructure, agriculture, so really important in setting the context for adaptation across a wide range of sectors. Really important to mention that there's a marine climate change impacts report card as well, lots of information in there, and these have a similar sort of focus, identifying impacts, what we might see under climate change. So really good source of information there. Within Natural England, we have our national character area profiles. They are being updated at the moment, but they have and they will incorporate climate change impacts in those for the based on the description of the character area and the landscape within that and the features, and then what that's likely to mean under a changing climate. Internally, the climate change team, we then took that NCA approach and did some really detailed assessments at that NCA level, looking at how we could identify features and look at how they'll be impacted and how we might act on that under climate change adaptation. And they're all available on our Access to Evidence Climate Change publication site. The link is there on the slide, and there's many, many more of our documents on climate change incorporated there. So do go and have a look. Next slide, please. The next slide, when we move on, we're talking about now not written and documented resources, but now spatial data. We spent a lot of time working on spatial data and really still link back to the principles of climate change adaptation, resilience building and accommodating change, and thinking about ecological networks and those kinds of approaches, but really trying to make it spatial so that we can use the maps and the features that we're identifying and the metrics that we're using to tell us what we might want to do and where we might want to do it. So for many years I've been working on the National Biodiversity Climate Change Vulnerability Assessment. That's the picture at the top right. This method aims to look at a range of different metrics that describe some of the ways that habitats, in this case, might be vulnerable to climate change. We look at the sensitivity of habitats, how fragmented they are, whether they're under management for their existing issues at the moment, and also how varied the topography is. So we use those metrics to say something about the vulnerability of those habitats in those particular locations to climate change. And that gives us an idea of where we might want to change some of those things. So therefore, we might want to try to look at the most fragmented patches of habitats and increase the size of them or join them up with the surrounding habitat areas. We also have been working recently on a national habitat network, again looking at the current location of habitats, the current location of where we're working to restore habitats, and then looking around those areas for the real opportunities to create habitat in the vicinity of existing habitat. So we're looking at soil types that can support habitat creation and restoration. And both of these data sets are available for download via our data manager's site. I can send around information on that later as well. But these are things, they're not the answer to the problem, but they are ways to sort of spatially represent some of the issues that we're trying to come to grips with. There's also another couple of slides on, another couple of images on there. Simon's already mentioned refugia, which is the left-hand side. But then we have another really detailed project looking at the risks and opportunities that species will face under climate change. There's a great report on that. All the information is in there on our Access to Evidence catalogue. But what it included was over 3,000 climate envelope models for species to look at where the climate space that they currently have may change in the future under the projections. And that gives us, when we draw together information on climate envelope changes plus habitat network or habitat availability for a species, it gives us the opportunity to think about the interaction of those issues across our landscape. Next slide, please. Now, of course, it's really important for us to be able to draw together information, evidence, our experience into these resources and into the spatial data, but it's incredibly important for us to value local knowledge and information too, of course. So I think it's probably easy for us to conceptually think about the idea of using spatial data, perhaps the vulnerability data, the National Habitat Network data, to think about where we might want to do things. We can then look at the adaptation manual perhaps to say, oh, here's a habitat sheet that's giving us information on impacts and vulnerabilities and adaptation options. We'll look at how we do things in the locations that the spatial data suggests. But then we need to make sure that we are working with local colleagues, that local colleagues have access to these evidence bases in order to input their local information, knowledge of opportunities and constraints, etc., because that's the only way it's going to work at that local scale. So I'm going to move on to talk about some frameworks that we've developed to allow us to do that, a landscape scale one and a national nature reserve focused framework. And we think we've got the evidence that those frameworks do allow us to use the written data as well alongside with the local knowledge that's so important. Next slide, please. So last few minutes is going to be a bit of a whiz through, I'm afraid, but just a couple of examples of the different scales that we're working at and the frameworks that we've been putting together. So first of all, Simon Duffield, he's created an approach to help us think about site scale adaptation and focused on national nature reserves. So as we've acknowledged, all of our special sites will need to adapt. This method's been put together to help us do that. And it's now embedded fully within the NNR management planning process. And that's reviewed every 5 years. So it's there and it's embedded, and it's using a well-established framework that looks at what changes we're likely to see, what the projected impacts of those changes are likely to be, allows us to go on to then form a vulnerability assessment of the features that we're interested in and identifying the responses. And that being within the process of NNR management planning is really important. Next slide, please. The experience that we have, the experience that Simon and colleagues are having, is that it is fully embedded. It works well for the site managers. They're engaged in the process. And one of the things that happens as we do as the management planning process is carried out is they hold management plan summits. So a range of national, local experts, stakeholders collaborate. They come together to talk about this, and climate change, is embedded as part of that. It also, due to the fact that it's a 5-year cycle, it allows for an adaptive management approach, as has been described. How we look at the vulnerabilities and the impacts. We put in place an adaptation program. We start to see what's happening. We monitor that, and then if it's working or if it's not working, we adapt the approach that we have. So that 5-year cycle allows us to do that. Over 50% of our NNRs have done this, and the rest are following. It's completely embedded in the system that we have now. And Simon's starting to analyse the results and feedback from the process so far. There's a huge range of graphs and information that's been drawn out. This is an example of the spread of the vulnerability assessment by ecosystem that's been carried out by the site managers. So we can see some of the ecosystem types there coming up quite as highly vulnerable. So perhaps unsurprisingly, we've got coastal areas, wetland areas, upland areas are being assessed as being highly vulnerable to climate change, with some of the others coming down into a more sort of medium level. But that is interesting information to have. We also have a range analysis on the range of actions and how they fall into the groupings that Simon described of resilience and accommodating change. Most of them at the moment falling into that resilience, but some spreading into the accommodating change. Next slide, please. So moving up to a landscape scale. All of our work, so far, the NCA approach, the NNR approach, this approach, we're using the same basis in this established framework of identifying the features of interest that you have in an area. So in this case now we're moving up to that landscape scale. For us, in the flow diagram there, we've said focus area because that's what we're interested in. So yeah, the features of interest in your area, and that might be a particular feature or a habitat or an ecosystem or indeed an ecosystem service. Look at how the climate change variables are going to change. So the consequences for those features of a change in climate variable, and then what the impacts of that consequence and change might be. That way then you can think about the location and the situation that feature is within, and then think about how to assess its vulnerability. And that way you can then come up with your adaptation actions. It's important to do this. What we've tried to do here is a fairly swift version of an assessment framework. We would like to see this done in partnership, but it's available for you to do on your own. It should be relatively quick to work through. So and then moving on from having done your assessment, you need to deliver that, you need to communicate that, and really you need to monitor and adjust and carry out adaptive management. We also need to think about the cross-cutting impacts that we might see from different adaptation options. There's bound to be conflicts, trade-offs, win-wins, sometimes no regrets. There'll be a range of different outcomes for the options. We need to be aware of those. And we work through identifying opportunities and barriers, making sure we're working with partners, but also want to encourage innovative approaches to adaptation. And as I said, this landscape scale assessment framework, alongside an RSPB version, is inside the adaptation manual now. Next slide, please. Very, very briefly, we've been working with a range of different people inside and outside to test that approach. Our colleagues in the Thames and Solent team have looked at it for their Burnwood focus area, and it's really helpful for us to work through this and see how it's working for people, identifying those assets. And it does work at the range of different asset scales, so particularly, looking at veteran trees, looking at broad habitats, ecosystems, and services and things like that. One of the most important lessons that has come out of the trialling with a range of partners, but particularly with Burnwood, is that it's important to note that it's a working document. This should be, again, as like the NNR approach, on a rolling basis, so that we can definitely utilise that management, adaptive management approach. Next slide, please. Finally, I'm going to wrap up just by reminding us that we have that further scale of national level, and we need those sites and landscape scale to fit into the coherent picture at a national level, and we have that. We will have that in the Nature Recovery Network. I won't go into detail here, but we are working to make sure that the principles, the resources that we have are fed in how we define our Nature Recovery Network. It's absolutely vital that climate change adaptation and mitigation, and you'll hear more about that next week, is included in the Nature Recovery Network design. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you, Sarah, and it's back to me just to wrap up. So the Nature Recovery Network is really going to be one of the key mechanisms for conservation and the recovery of nature, restoration of habitats and the rest in the years ahead, or at least we certainly hope so. And I just wanted to finish just by registering, of course, that we can't do conservation in a vacuum, just in our own little islands of protected area. We do understand that actually our land, our sea, our inland freshwater are all under tremendous pressure to provide food, recreation, timber, and so on, as well as climate change adaptation and mitigation. So we need to work within that context. Next slide. And we've talked today about adaptation and the way it affects conservation, my little slide here in the middle, but actually we're going to be going on in the next 2 weeks to look at nature-based solutions where better land management, better sea management, better freshwater management can deliver benefits, not just for species, but also at the same time we hope to help to contribute towards reducing climate change and also to build our resilience and adapt to it. Next slide, and this is the final concluding one. So just some conclusions. Just before I do that, I just also wanted to say some thanks, because I'm very aware we've skipped through a huge amount of material today, and there are lots of people we've worked with, including some on the call, people from the University of York and Exeter, British Trust for Ornithology, RSPB, Hutton Institute, SNH, just people I've noted down, and thanks to all of you and any we've forgotten to acknowledge. But just to conclude then, what message should we take away? Well, first of all, adaptation is a now problem. It's not something to be put off. Impacts are happening now. We do have to adapt. It's not optional, I think. We need to build resilience, but increasingly we need to manage change, and we need to shift more into that space. And that's a difficult place to be. And I'm just going to answer some of the questions that have been coming up, which I've been monitoring. I just want to actually touch on those at this point, that how do we make that decision between what we're trying to hang on to build the resilience of, and where we're actually having to embrace change. It's very hard, and it's hard for good reason, because actually we don't know what success there will be globally in addressing climate change in terms of mitigation. If the world manages to get its act together and hold global climate change to about 1.5 degrees, we can hold on to a lot. There's a huge scope to build resilience. Once it starts to go up to 2, 3, 4 degrees, it gets very hard indeed. So we have to be prepared to be flexible and change as we go along. One of the key things I think at the moment is that we need to shift to looking at the whole of our sites together, not just individual ones, and to look at restoring natural processes where we can, and perhaps to be more open to what outcome that might be for nature in terms of specific species. If a species is thriving in one place but declining in another, well, let's make the most of where it is thriving, and that's the kind of start of it for me. How you flex things like SSSI designations deal with that is a mighty big challenge, but it is one we are looking at. And yeah, the final point there is there are lots of resources available. That's another thing that's been coming up on the chat. But the adaptation manual is a good starting point, but we will produce a document, it's an FAQ if you like, based on some of these questions, and that will also include some links to where you can go to get some of these other resources that we've talked about, including some of the maps. If you have a problem, then do drop us a line. And then, yeah, next week, nature-based solutions for climate change mitigation. I'm just going to quickly scan through the questions, see if we've got one or two that we can very quickly answer here, in addition to that more general point. Simon, can you say in a minute how high ground fertility management is changing?
Damn, why did someone ask me on that one? I think the response is that the management that was put in place to try and manage their obvious position habitat, it just doesn't seem to be responding in the same way. So you're not getting the same habitat response from the same management, and they think it's either due to warming, so more scrub coming through, possibly more grasses taking out the bracken, or interacted with nitrogen deposition as well. So it's the interventions that they used to put on place to try and develop the habitat doesn't seem to be delivering the habitat that it used to.
Okay, thanks, Simon. One question here is, do we expect that we'll need to adapt to a permanently changed climate, or will it revert to what it was? Again, it does depend on success with climate change mitigation. It will take a long time. There is every prospect that it would eventually return, if we really do get on top of climate change mitigation, there is every prospect it would return to something like normal. So it could be temporary, but it's, we're not really talking this century probably. So in terms of species survival and so on, I don't, well, perhaps for long-lived tree species, there's some hope there just by surviving, but really we need to be prepared to adapt for the long term. The marine environment, yeah, a couple of questions there. I quite agree, the marine environment is really important. We haven't said so much about it here, and I know that. Coastal, there's a lot of action in terms of adaptation, and we've talked a bit about that. And that you will find in the Climate Change Adaptation Manual and elsewhere. In the true marine, once you're out away from the coast, our scope to intervene is smaller, although there's a really key role for protected areas and making sure they're in the right place. We didn't have time to go into that in great detail. As I say, most of the interventionist adaptation is more in terms of land, but a lot of the principles do apply, and I would recommend you take a look at the Marine Climate Change Impacts Partnership website. They not only have general report cards on impacts, but there is also a very good report card on adaptation as well, so I would commend that to you. We've got about 1 minute. Does the biodiversity net gain metric take account of the impacts of climate change? We are working on it. Not fully, I would suggest, no. And I think
it does have a fragmentation metric, so there is an element of what we've been talking, a bit of what we've been talking about, and something that's important for accommodating change and resilience building. But the eco-metric, the next steps, I think, will be more important in making sure that that is incorporated as well.
Okay. Well, I really don't want to take any more of the day. I'm conscious, people have given up their time to listen to it. So thank you for joining us. We haven't been through all of the questions, I know that, but we will work to produce an FAQ. that will probably be put together with ones from last week and the following weeks, but we will make that available, including links to some of the resources. If in the meanwhile you've got an urgent question, drop us a line, and thank you all very much for joining us. And stay safe and stay alert, I believe I have to tell you. So I wish you a good afternoon. Bye.